Have you ever seen a photograph that seemed to remember more than it should? A moment frozen in time, yet pulsing quietly with stories untold. In the heart of Atlanta, an archivist named Margaret stumbled upon one such photograph, a family standing before the gates of Piedmont Park in 1948, dressed in their Sunday best, smiling before a place they were never allowed to enter. What began as a simple discovery soon unraveled into something far greater, a hidden legacy spanning generations. 43 photographs meticulously taken by ordinary people who dared to record a truth the world preferred to forget. Who were they? Why did they risk everything to document what others refused to see? And how did these forgotten images survive decades of silence to finally speak again, louder than ever? Tonight, we follow the faint trail left behind by a family who understood long before history caught up that sometimes bearing witness is the most powerful act of all. In the quiet, temperature-controlled archive room of the Atlanta History Center, Margaret Hayes stood still. The soft hum of the air system filled the silence as her gloved hands held a faded photograph. Delicate, almost breathing with time. For 15 years, she had studied images from the civil rights era. Thousands of faces, thousands of forgotten stories. But something about this one made her pause. It showed an African-American family of 4 standing proudly before an ornate park gate in 1948. Their smiles were warm, genuine. The father's fedora tilted at just the right angle. The mother's white gloves gleamed softly, even through the film's age. 2 children beamed at the camera, unaware of the weight history would place upon their innocence. At first, Margaret had passed it by just another pleasant family portrait from the post-war years. But some instinct, quiet and persistent, tugged at her. Photographs, she knew, sometimes whispered secrets in the corners, in the margins, in the parts you weren't meant to notice. After lunch, she returned to her desk, the afternoon sun cutting a golden line across the archive. She placed the photo under her magnifying glass, and that's when she saw it. Behind the family, half hidden beneath the branch of an old oak tree, was a sign. Its paint was chipped, its letters weathered, but still clear enough to read. White's Only City Ordinance, 1923. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her camera, capturing the discovery. This wasn't just a family portrait. This was testimony. This was defiance captured forever in silver and light. She leaned back, heart steadying, mind racing. Who were they? Why choose that place, that sign, that moment? Was it chance or was it intention? And most hauntingly, what became of them? Did they live to see the world shift even a little toward justice? Margaret documented every detail, the curling ironwork of magnolia blossoms on the gate, the faint patterns that might help trace the location. Then, at her computer, she began to search. The ordinance number 1923 was a clue. An hour later, the pieces began to align. The ornate gates matched photographs of Piedmont Park's eastern entrance, redesigned in 1935 as part of a Depression-era project. She dove into city directories from 1948, scrolling through the names of African-American families living near the park. There were many. Men and women who built homes in neighborhoods that bordered beauty. They were forbidden to enter playgrounds, green fields, laughter carried on the wind they could not share. Margaret picked up her phone. Robert, you need to see this, she said softly. 20 minutes later, Dr. Robert Chen stood beside her, peering through the magnifying lens. His eyes traced the edges of the frame, thoughtful, reverent. This, he murmured, is no accident. Look how they're positioned. The gate perfectly framed, the sign just visible enough. They wanted to be seen there, to be remembered there. He met her gaze, and in that shared silence, both understood. Someone 77 years ago had chosen to stand where they were not allowed to smile, where they were not welcomed. And in doing so, they left behind a quiet rebellion sealed forever in the fragile grain of a photograph. The question lingered in the air like dust in the archive light. Why? What were they trying to preserve? Margaret nodded slowly, her thoughts already spiraling forward. This might not be an isolated photograph, she murmured to herself. What if there are more? What if this was part of something larger, something intentional? For the next 3 days, she searched tirelessly through the Atlanta History Center's uncatalogued collections. Long after the sun had set, when the building was silent, except for the soft hum of the air vents and the distant ticking of an old wall clock. The photograph, she discovered, had come from an estate donated 6 months earlier, the estate of a deceased woman named Dorothy Patterson. The donation records were frustratingly brief: several boxes of papers, family memorabilia, photographs all waiting to be sorted and catalogued. Nothing remarkable, nothing to hint at the weight they carried. Margaret filed a request for full access to the Patterson collection. 2 archivists wheeled out 3 large boxes on a cart, each marked only with temporary numbers. Her heart beat faster as she opened the first box. Inside, old letters, church programs, school reports, faded receipts, the quiet fragments of a family's life. The second box revealed stacks of photographs, birthday parties, weddings, graduations, Sunday gatherings, all the moments that made up an ordinary life. Sweet, familiar, unremarkable. But the third box was different. Wrapped carefully in layers of tissue paper lay 43 photographs, each enclosed in protective, glassine envelopes. Margaret spread them across the long table, one by one. Her breath caught. Every photograph showed the same family, the father, the mother, the 2 children, always standing before different landmarks across Atlanta. A movie theater with the rear entrance marked colored. A drinking fountain labeled white beside a smaller rust-stained one marked colored. A grand public library with a small separate building behind it for Black residents. Each photo was dated, each location noted in careful handwriting: July 1946, September 1947, March 1948. And beneath the dates, brief, heartbreaking inscriptions: where we cannot go, where Sarah cannot drink, where James cannot read. Margaret sank into her chair, staring at the quiet defiance captured in those images. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't just family nostalgia. It was a deliberate act, a visual record of segregation created by a family who somehow understood that one day someone would need to see the truth. She had to know more. Who was Dorothy Patterson? And how was she connected to these people who had risked so much simply to be seen? The estate papers listed her last address, a modest house in the West End, an old historically Black neighborhood. Margaret drove there on a cool October morning. The air was crisp, the sky a soft, washed blue. The house stood abandoned, a for sale sign half buried in the overgrown grass. Paint peeled from the walls. The porch sagged with age. It looked tired, like it had been waiting too long for someone to remember it. Next door, a tidy little home with flower boxes in the windows. When Margaret knocked, an elderly woman answered, silver hair pinned neatly, a floral apron dusted with flour. "Yes, dear. I'm Margaret Hayes from the Atlanta History Center," she said gently. "I'm researching a collection donated by Dorothy Patterson. I believe she lived next door." At the sound of that name, the woman's expression softened. "Oh, Dorothy," she said, smiling faintly. "Yes, I knew her well. For 30 years. Quiet womankind. She passed away last spring." She introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Gibson and opened the door wider. "Come in, dear. I was just baking. You look like you could use some coffee." Inside, the kitchen smelled of bread and comfort. As they sat at the table, Eleanor spoke softly, her eyes distant with memory. Dorothy was a teacher 40 years in Atlanta's schools. She never married, never had children. But she loved to talk about her family, especially her aunt and uncle. She paused, stirring sugar into her coffee. She said they were brave people, that they did something important, once something the world should remember. Margaret's pulse quickened. "Do you remember their names?" Eleanor thought for a moment, then nodded. "Sarah and James." Sarah was her father's sister, Dorothy's aunt. She mentioned them often, especially near the end. Said they had lived through hard times, but faced them with quiet courage. She told me she'd been going through old family papers, organizing them all carefully. She said it was time for their story to be told. Before she was gone, Margaret blinked away tears. Dorothy had known. She had understood. The photographs weren't just history. They were a message she had prepared for whoever would listen next. Back at the archive that afternoon, Margaret searched the remaining papers with renewed purpose. At the bottom of the last box, buried under layers of yellowed envelopes, she found it a family tree drawn in Dorothy's careful handwriting. At the top, Sarah Mitchell, born 1918. James Mitchell, born 1915. Their children, Ruth, 1940, Thomas, 1943. Everything was there. Every name, every date. Following the trail, Margaret located James Mitchell's name in a 1948 city directory, a porter at Atlanta's terminal station, long hours, low pay. Sarah's name was missing, as was often the case for women who worked quietly in other people's homes or stayed to care for their own. A week later, Margaret found Ruth Mitchell's obituary dated 2003. Ruth had passed away at 63, survived by two daughters, Patricia Collins and Dorothy Patterson. Margaret froze. Dorothy wasn't just a distant descendant. She was their granddaughter. The photographs had been taken by her grandparents, Sarah and James Mitchell. This was her inheritance, a legacy of memory, resistance, and love, carefully passed through generations. Among Dorothy's papers, Margaret found one last envelope. Inside lay a letter, fragile, folded neatly, dated 1968. The year Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. The year everything seemed to break. It was written by Sarah Mitchell to her daughter Ruth. And when Margaret began to read it, she realized she was holding the heart of the story, the final piece of what the Mitchells had tried to preserve. It was a fragile thing, a letter, typed on thin onion skin paper, the kind that crinkled like whispers when touched. It had been folded along its original creases, preserved carefully in a plastic sleeve that Dorothy had added years later. It began simply, "My dear Ruth." Sarah's words carried both formality and warmth, like a voice echoing across time. In these dark days, as our city and our nation mourn, I find myself thinking of the photographs your father and I took 20 years ago. You were only 8 then, and little Tommy was 5. You once asked me why we dressed in our Sunday best to stand outside places we could never enter. Why we smiled for the camera in front of signs that denied our humanity. Sarah's voice, through the ink and paper, seemed to tremble slightly. You wondered why we made you witness it when we could have simply stayed home, spared you the sting of exclusion. But my child words fade. Memories are questioned. Stories are denied by those who never lived them. But photographs, she paused there. The next line was underlined. iPhone cars. Photographs do not lie. They had wanted evidence, undeniable proof for the future. Proof for Ruth, for her children, for anyone who might one day say it wasn't that bad or that never really happened. Sarah and James had created a record that could outlast both memory and denial. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Each time her heart ached a little more. Tears blurred the ink as she finally understood what this family had risked and why. Margaret and Robert soon began to dig deeper. They wanted to know if Sarah and James's quiet act of resistance, their secret photography project, was unique. What they found astonished them. Yes, other African Americans had captured scenes of segregation during the Jim Crow years. Gordon Parks, the legendary photographer, had turned his lens toward injustice and shaken the conscience of the nation. But he had resources, connections, a platform. Sarah and James had none of that. They were ordinary working people, a domestic worker and a porter, using what little they had to create an archive for a future they could only imagine. They were activists, Robert said softly one night, surrounded by open books and yellowed documents. Not the kind who march or shout, but the kind who understand the power of bearing witness. They both knew what that meant, that to document was to defy erasure. To hold a camera steady in the face of threat was in itself a form of courage. Records showed that in 1949, James had been questioned by police for photographing the colored waiting room at Terminal Station, the very place he worked each day. A dusty police report read, "Colored male taking pictures, claimed for family use. Warned not to cause trouble." Such simple words, yet beneath them a quiet menace. Sarah had paid her own price. In 1948, she lost her job after her employer discovered her photographs of segregated facilities. A letter she wrote to her sister told the rest. She said she wouldn't have someone in her house who tries to make white people look bad. For months, the family struggled. The photographs had cost them money, stability, perhaps even safety. But they never stopped. When Margaret found Patricia Collins, Ruth's daughter, now 78 and sharp as ever, the story took on new life. Patricia invited her to a sunlit apartment in Decatur walls covered with family photographs. Weddings, birthdays, new lives unfolding after hardship. "I remember them well," Patricia said, pointing at a frame that showed Sarah and James in the 1970s. Grandma was always composed, dignified, gentle, but firm. Grandpa was quiet, but always watching, always thinking. Mama used to say he saw things others didn't. Patricia smiled, her eyes glistening. Grandma kept those photographs in a wooden trunk in her room, locked it with a little key she wore around her neck. Sometimes she'd open it and tell us stories. She'd hold up a picture and say, "This is the Fox Theatre, where your mother couldn't see a movie with her white classmates. This is the library I wasn't allowed to enter. This is the restaurant where your grandfather worked but never could sit to eat." Each photograph a quiet act of remembrance. Each story a bridge across generations. Did they ever talk about why they took them? Margaret asked softly. Patricia nodded, her gaze distant. Once when I was 12, I asked Grandpa about it. He said, "We want you to know our real history, not the cleaned up version. The people who write history books might forget, or they might lie, but these photographs won't. They show exactly how it was." He had made her promise to keep them safe, to never let them be forgotten. 3 months later, Margaret curated an exhibition at the Atlanta History Center. Its title bearing witness: The Mitchell Family's Photographic Record of Segregation 1946-1950. On opening night, the air was thick with emotion. Historians came. Students came. Old veterans of the civil rights struggle stood in silence before the photographs, tears glistening under the warm museum lights. The images lined the walls in careful order, scenes of defiance wrapped in quiet dignity. Next to each photograph, Sarah's handwritten notes appeared, enlarged her voice, whispering across decades. Visitors stopped, stared, and lingered. Each image was more than a photograph. It was a heartbeat. From the past, proof that silence could not erase truth. And as Margaret stood there, watching strangers rediscover a history once hidden in a wooden trunk, she felt something profound, that what Sarah and James had done in their quiet, steadfast way was perhaps the bravest kind of resistance of all. The heart of the exhibition was the photograph that had started it all, the image of a proud black family standing before the gates of Piedmont Park in 1948. It hung beneath soft museum light, beside Sarah's 1968 letter to her daughter Ruth, printed in full her words, breathing across decades, explaining why the photographs mattered. That evening, Patricia Collins spoke to the crowded room. Her voice, though old, was steady. "My grandparents never saw themselves as heroes," she said. "They were ordinary people doing what they believed was right to preserve the truth. They wore their best clothes and smiled in those photographs because they refused to let segregation take their dignity. They wanted the world to see not only what was denied to them, but what could never be taken away." The story spread quickly. Local reporters came first, then national ones. Within days, classrooms and museums across the country were talking about the Mitchell photographs, a family's quiet rebellion turned into living history. Historians said it was unlike anything they had seen, not the work of journalists or protest leaders, but of a family, documenting their own exclusion systematically, year after year, not for fame, but for remembrance. Weeks later, the Atlanta City Council passed a resolution honoring Sarah and James Mitchell for their extraordinary contribution to civil rights history and to the city's reckoning with its past. 6 months after the exhibition opened, Margaret stood again before the gates of Piedmont Park. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Patricia, along with the great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of Sarah and James. Descendants who had never known these photographs existed until Margaret brought them into the light. It was a warm spring morning. Children laughed. Families of every color filled the park that had once excluded them. Before them stood a new historical marker. Its inscription read, "Here in 1948, Sarah and James Mitchell photographed their family outside gates they could not enter under segregation laws." Their documentation of 43 sites across Atlanta stands as a record of both injustice and dignity, a testament ensuring future generations would know the truth of what was endured and overcome. Patricia placed a bouquet of flowers at its base, her hands trembling. "They'd be amazed by all this," she whispered. They never wanted recognition. They only wanted the truth remembered, so no one could ever say it didn't happen. Margaret had arranged for all 43 photographs to be digitized in high resolution, now freely available to anyone through the Library of Congress archives. Students could study them, historians could cite them, and families could simply see them, a record born of courage and care. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to fade, Margaret lingered by the gate, thinking of all those whose hands had carried the story forward. Dorothy, who preserved the photos, Ruth and Thomas, who protected them, and most of all, Sarah and James Mitchell. Two ordinary souls who understood long before history caught up that to be seen was to survive. And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet of the archive, their camera still remembers a flash of light against the dark.